And my name is Brian Keller. I have to get the housekeeping out of the way or else I'll forget. My colleague Howie is here. Go ahead and stand up, Howie. Howie works on our documentation team for Visual Studio, and he's here all week taking your feedback on the Visual Studio documentation. So if you have any feedback for him, please pull him aside. If you need a basketball partner, I think he's like 6'20" or so. So he's happy to help there too. But we really do listen, and we know we made a lot of changes in the documentation for this release, and we'll be happy to take your feedback and make sure we continue to improve on that moving forward. So how many people in the room do we have who happen to be manual testers? I don't expect a lot at a tech ed audience. Okay, that's kind of my expectation, and that's fine. Manual testing is really something that I think the entire team needs to care about. And after this presentation, I hope you'll see the value in using our tool set within your team for doing manual testing. And even if you're a developer or a project manager or a stakeholder, someone who's writing the checks to get software built, I want to show you why we have some interesting tools in here that can really help elevate your manual tests so that the rest of your team can benefit from that. So if you went to the keynote yesterday, we laid out our longer-term vision for Microsoft's application lifecycle management strategy. And all along, Visual Studio has started by being focused on making developers sitting at their desk writing code for 40 hours a week really productive. And that continues to be a large investment moving forward. But on more and more, software is really built by teams, right? And it's not just the developers sitting at their desks who need to communicate with each other. You have to communicate with architects, with project managers, with stakeholders. So in the 2010 release, our big focus was adding the manual test organizations to that lifecycle flow so that you could work with tools such as this to get really rich, interesting bugs that you could then make sure that you had everything at your fingertips to fix. And then moving forward, we're bringing in other stakeholders from the business to help make sure that you refine your requirements. We're bringing in IT operations so that once you start getting bugs from production, that becomes really interesting data that has everything at your fingertips that you can use to start to diagnose those problems and ultimately, of course, fix them. So today I'm going to be talking about manual testing. My name is Brian Keller. I work at Microsoft, so if you're in the neighborhood, let me know. I'll buy you lunch. I've been on Visual Studio for about 9 years now. I'm also on Channel 9. And I put all of my presentations, as well as my virtual machines, demo scripts, anything and everything you might want to use to go back and start diving deeper with these technologies, or go back and rewatch some of my presentations. It all goes on my blog. I've worked on a couple of books. One is focused on the entire suite of application lifecycle management tooling that we shipped in 2010. And then if you were the TFS administrator, you might be interested in the new book we just came out with around setting up and maintaining TFS. Okay, so in this session, we'll be talking about why we built manual testing as part of this suite of tooling and some of the key design goals that we had there. And then I'm going to dive into the tool and get really hands-on with showing you how to work with test plans, how to author your first test cases and run those test cases, how to fast forward through those test cases so that you're not wasting a lot of time as a manual tester clicking before you get to the point in your application that's actually interesting to test. I'll show you a brief introduction to creating a coded UI test out of a manual test. The session tomorrow that I have tomorrow morning will focus end-to-end on test automation and specifically those coded UI tests, a new test type that we introduced in 2010, as well as our lab management infrastructure that allows you to set up an end-to-end build, deploy, test environment so that maybe every night I build my software, I push it out to one or more virtual environments, and from there I automatically run all of my automated tests, whether they're unit tests or coded UI tests or web performance tests, and then I've got the environments all staged in the morning so that when the manual test team comes in and they need to run their manual tests against a SQL Server 2008 environment versus a SQL Server 2008 R2 environment, they've got everything all staged and ready to go. They're not wasting any of their time doing setup. So come back to tomorrow morning if you're interested in that. So this isn't a marketing presentation, but I did quickly just want to show you how you get the tools that we're talking about today. Microsoft Test Manager is a new tool which you can buy by itself with the Test Professional SKU. So that's Visual Studio 2010 Test Professional. That's the SKU that you would buy for your manual testers who need to work with test plans and then push their test cases back up to Team Foundation Server and file bugs to the rest of the team. Visual Studio Ultimate, as you can see by kind of being the masthead there, it actually includes everything. That's our kitchen sink SKU, if you will. And so if you have Visual Studio Ultimate, you'll also notice that you have Microsoft Test Manager installed, so you can open that up and work with test plans and understand exactly what your testers are working on as well. And then the other thing to point out is that our test product does require Team Foundation Server, but with Visual Studio 2010, any of you that have an MSDN subscription, you actually already own a license to Team Foundation Server, so you can go out and download it today and get that up and running in about an hour. So I'm a rock climber. I live in Seattle, and so there's a lot of great mountains and rock climbing in my backyard. And the way that I think about software testing is kind of similar to the way that I think about getting ready for a major rock climbing expedition. You know, I spend a lot of time in the gym, although not lately. I spend a lot of time in the gym working on training, working on my basic skills, practicing my first aid, learning my equipment, buying new equipment, and trying to get ready so that by the time I go out on the mountain, I'm ready to go. The cost of failure when I'm in the gym is relatively low. I might jam my finger, I might forget how to use one of my safety devices, but it's no big deal. Maybe I'm out of the gym for a couple of days. By the time I get out onto a mountain and I'm working on, you know, a 3-4 day expedition, and I look behind me, and I don't know if you can see this, but there's actually a storm cloud moving in behind me there. About 20 minutes after this picture was taken, we got hit by about a 50-mile-an-hour hailstorm. At that time, you're really hoping that you've done all of your conditioning and all of your training and you know how to use your gear, because the cost of failure at that point is really, really high. Software testing is the same way, right? If we can catch a bug when we're in the zone, we're working within Visual Studio, and we press F5, and the compiler gives us a warning that says, hey, you just messed something up, or you broke a unit test, we can fix that relatively quickly. You know, we know the changes we just made. We know what part of the code we're working on. It maybe costs you 20 minutes of your time. But by the time that code works its way past the test environment and into production, the costs start to skyrocket, right? I mean, set aside the fact that you may find a bug in production 6 months after the last developer touched that piece of code, and now you have to go back and remember what you were working on and maybe find some expertise who's familiar with that particular set of code. The results could also be that you have a lawsuit on your hands, and you've got some serious problem that is resulting from a bug that was discovered in production by your customers. A few quick examples here. The USS Yorktown, this is a famous example. They started deploying all of these computers into carriers and other ships within the Navy back in the mid-90s and automating a lot of what used to be very manual or mechanical tasks. And when they did that on this particular ship, a poor crewman pressed a 0 into a text box, and it caused the entire ship to be dead in the water for almost 3 hours. You know, I don't want to be that poor Navy seaman who pressed the 0 in the text box. I really don't want to be the guy who was supposed to test and make sure that didn't happen, right? Luckily, no one was hurt there. The European Space Program had a famous example here where they had a divide overflow. They reused some code from Ariane 4. This is Ariane 5, had a different flight path, basically resulted in a divide overflow, which caused the entire rocket ship to explode. So that's $370 million in 1996 prices. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, there's a great presentation called An Illustrated History of Failure that was presented at OSCON a few years ago. It's a great presentation. The speaker goes out and he attempts to quantify the value of a human life in terms of the GDP of a country divided by the working years of the population. And he comes up with some number like the value of a human life is on average something like $3 million contribution to the GDP. And he says that due to the magic of software, it's possible for us to eradicate not only our lives, but all of the lives of people around us on our teams due to one software bug. So my goal for doing these sessions is to make sure that none of us show up in a future Illustrated History of Failure presentation. And then one last one here, the F-22 Raptor flying west past the international date line for the first time, crosses the international date line. They forgot to test for that scenario. The computers all shut down. Thankfully, everyone was able to fly safely back to Hawaii because there was good weather that day. Now, of course, I work for Microsoft, the world's largest software developer, last time I checked. So if I'm going to throw rocks, this is, I'm not sure exactly how I would close this. This is Visual C# 2005 Express. This file is still copying. I'm sure we've all been there before. An error has occurred while displaying the error that has occurred while creating an error report. You see the problem with this one? It's missing a period at the very end. And this is my favorite, just, okay. So this is everybody's problem, right? We all need to come together as an industry to really increase software quality as a whole. So what do we do about it? Well, back before the 2010 release, we took a look at the entire testing ecosystem. And at the far left-hand side, you have people that are coming in the morning, a few of those people that raised their hand, and they're executing manual tests every day. They're looking at either Word documents or Excel spreadsheets or some other tool where they have a list of test cases, and they're clicking, typing, looking at the screen saying, does this look right? At the far right end of the spectrum, we have people that are writing unit tests or writing other scripting that is going out and hammering the website with test automation logic to try to find bugs. And the reality is that 70% of testing is still manual testing. So if you look at this across any size organization, we found this to be true. The unfortunate side of that is that over the last 10 or 15 years, the majority of the industry in terms of software vendors and open source projects have really targeted the right end of the spectrum. So how many unit testing frameworks, how many mocking frameworks do we have out there? I mean, it's just limitless, right? But unfortunately, those poor manual testers are kind of left behind. There's not a lot of great tooling out there for them. And so for this release, we really wanted to focus on giving them a great tool that was built from the ground up specifically for them. The other thing we realized is that when a tester goes to a developer and says, hey, I found a bug, right? I'm sure this never happens to you, but at Microsoft it happens a lot where someone looks at the tester and says, you know what? Works on my machine, right? Happens all the time. So why is this, right? I mean, probably the tester actually found a bug, and I believe the developers when they say that it actually works on their machine. But we've now created this situation where the two roles have to play ping pong and go back and forth. And the developer says, well, which build are you using? You know, last night's build. And, you know, what machine are you using? Oh, I'm using a 64-bit. Oh, what browser? You know, we don't support IE6 anymore. No, I'm using IE9. And it's just a lot of waste in the system. And it's a lot of waste if you're standing in the room, let alone if you've outsourced or offshored your testing organization so that you have to wait a full 24 hours before you can have a full exchange of dialogue back and forth. So we really wanted to make sure that our tool set could address that and start eliminating that waste from the system. So 3 things there. We want to make sure that we catch bugs before they find their way out into the production environment, and we can do that by giving you great tooling both within Visual Studio and for your manual test organizations. Number 2, we want to make sure that we give the testers a great set of tools that they can use to be productive as software testers. And number 3, we want to unlock that collaboration so that software testers can work more effectively with software developers, and we get rid of scenarios like, hey, it works on my machine, right? And so let me show you how we make that happen. Okay. So this is Microsoft Test Manager. Again, if you install Test Professional or Visual Studio Ultimate, then you'll have Microsoft Test Manager. Over on the left-hand side, you'll see that I have a list of all of my test suites. A test suite can be broken down a few different ways. The most common is to actually create a suite of tests for each requirement that the development team is implementing for that particular iteration. So here, if I open up this particular requirement, you can see that this is just stored as a work item within Team Foundation Server. If you call them requirements, if you call them features, user stories, it doesn't matter. Whatever the development team is building, that's one way to build your tests off of that. And so for this particular requirement, over on the right-hand side, you can see that I've written a couple of test cases, right? Another way to create test cases is just to create a test suite that can be an open folder of tests that you drop into here. So you might do that if you create test cases which don't correspond to a specific requirement, such as end-to-end tests that I might create. And then the third way to create your test suites is to use what's called a query-based suite. And because all of our test cases and all of our requirements are stored as work items within Team Foundation Server, we can start querying on them in interesting ways. So for example, this particular test plan is based on iteration 2. So in iteration 1, we did a bunch of testing as well, and some of those tests we may want to carry forward, and some we may want to say we don't need to test that anymore. And in that case, I could write a query here that says pull forward all of my high priority test cases from iteration 1. Okay, so we give you a few different ways to actually construct your test plans. The other thing that you need to know about test plans is that there's a lot of properties which go on behind the scenes, which dictate to your software testing team how their tests get run. So, for example, I talked about this no more, no repro problem where you have the tester that finds a bug and it works on the developer's machine. Wouldn't it be great if we can automatically capture information from that test run so that when we hand it off to the developer, we're not just giving them a one-line description that says, hey, when I clicked on that blue button, it broke. What we can do is we can automatically capture for you things like video recordings. And so if I jump into my test settings here, I can say automatically capture my actions. So actions are basically operating at the accessibility layer of the operating system to say, okay, you clicked on this button, you clicked on that button. Capturing actions, of course, depends on the type of application and its support for accessibility APIs, but most applications you'll be testing with web applications, WinForms, WPF applications. This works very well. So this hands the developer a list of exactly what the tester clicked on. The other thing that we can do is we can capture IntelliTrace information. So if you came to our foundational session yesterday, we showed you how IntelliTrace is like a VCR for your code. You can actually rewind and go back in time and see the entire execution call stack to say, hey, this is when we wrote to this file, and this is when we read from this registry key, and hey, we threw and caught an exception in here. So as you're running your manual tests or even your automated tests, you can turn these things on to automatically capture that payload of information so that when the developer opens up the bug, they see all of this right there at their fingertips. System information will capture things like how much RAM do you have, how many processors are you running, what version of operating system and service pack level. And then video recording is really interesting as well. One of the things that a lot of people like to do is actually capture video recording not only if they find a bug, but even if the test case passes. And this is interesting for a couple of reasons. One is if you outsource or offshore your testing, you can actually go back and verify that all the testers ran the tests like they were supposed to. So this gives you a nice audit trail to go back and make sure that all those tests were in fact run. The other nice thing that I've seen people do with this is they use this as kind of pseudo documentation. So if you're constantly handing off releases of your software to your customer, you can then go back to the videos and say, hey, look, here's exactly how that particular feature is working in last night's build. So there's a lot of really interesting things you can do in here. I would encourage you to also take a look at the test attachments cleaner that we released, because as you can imagine, you can start to fill up your hard drive space on your TFS server with lots and lots of data here, but we have a power tool that allows you to go back and clean up old data or clean up all of the video recordings from the last test iteration. There's lots of interesting things you can do in there. So what I usually advocate is that you have a few different test settings files, one that may be lightweight and then one that also captures full diagnostics, and that way your testers can pick and choose. Like if I find a bug using the lightweight diagnostics, I may drop into a full diagnostics that includes IntelliTrace and video recordings and lots of other information, and that way you can rerun that test and file that information with a richer payload of data, and you're not constantly using the full verbose setting of the test settings all of the time. The other thing here is that you'll notice I have roles up here as well. For my particular virtual machine, I'm using a single machine, but if you had tests that you were running which involved a database layer, an application tier, a web server, a client machine where the tester is actually interacting, you can define different test settings for each portion of your environment so that maybe I'm capturing an event log off of the SQL Server box, I'm capturing an IntelliTrace file off of the IIS machine, and then I'm capturing a video recording where the tester is actually running their tests. So you'll have those options if you set up multiple machines in that environment. The other thing to point out here is the test configurations. If we open up our test configurations, this is what allows you to describe how many different environments you need to run your tests in. So, for example, you may have some tests that need to work correctly on both IE and Firefox and Chrome. You can set up a different configuration in there, and that tells your testers when they're running their tests For this particular test case, you need to run it 3 different times. You can also override that on an individual test case basis. So for example, if I'm testing something that I know is only going to touch server-side logic, then I don't need to run that on 3 different browsers. I can just run that on a single browser and call it a day. So you can override that right within the test plan. So that's enough of the test metadata here. Let's go ahead and create our first test case. So I'll just create a new test case. And I'll save you from some of my typing skills here. So we want to create an end-to-end test that makes sure that I can shop for an item, I can add that to my shopping cart, I can pay, and at the end I get a receipt. So that's what I'm giving as a title for this test case. If this looks like any other work item you've used within Team Foundation Server, then that's a good thing because this, in fact, is just a work item within TFS. I'll take my steps in here, and this is literally just a plain text list of steps here that we're giving to the testers. There are a couple of things that light up if you use certain syntax. So here you can see this Twitter syntax here, at first, at last, at email. When I did that, it actually created these columns down here for parameterizing the test. So what I can do is rather than have to write this test 3 different times, once for North American addresses and once for South American addresses, I can actually just program different parameter values in here, and that will tell the testers that they need to run this 3 different times. So here are my parameter values. The other thing you'll see up here in the list of test steps is that we have an expected result. So at this particular test step, it's telling the tester you should take pause, look at the screen, make sure that that receipt number appears. You can also use attachments. So I can attach a bitmap image, for example, that says, hey, here's what the screenshot should look like. Or if you see this, then you know you found a bug because once in a while we have a receipt number that looks like this on certain browsers. So you can give the tester all the information they need to decide whether or not that test run is succeeding. So now that I've run my test, or authored my test, I'm now going to switch out of that and go into my test tab. Now the test tab is where your testers usually come in every morning and look at what they need to test. So here along the left-hand side, I see that same list of requirements-based suites. You'll notice that one of those doesn't actually show up because it's currently in planning, as indicated by this icon here. So I've switched this one to in planning, just so that doesn't randomize and distract my test team. Now, if I switch back to test, you can see that I have a few test cases that have been run before. So I have some failed test cases in here. I have some that are passing. And then I also have another state in here which is blocked. Blocked is a nice way for you to say, hey, look, I know that this feature isn't working in this build. Don't even try to run it. So maybe if the first test case you run in the day is creating a new account, and the second test case is supposed to be logging in with that account, but the first step failed, you might want to go ahead and block the rest of the test cases which depend on that. So now we have my end-to-end tests here. Here's my new test case. We'll just go ahead and run this. I can also select options to say run with lightweight diagnostics or full diagnostics. I'll keep it lightweight for now. And this is going to launch the Microsoft Test Runner. When Microsoft Test Runner comes up, one of the things it asks me is whether or not I want to create an action recording. And so I mentioned earlier, we want to make testers more productive at doing what they do, which is running tests. And if you've ever been a manual tester before, you know that it can be a very labor-intensive, very boring job sometimes. I was a tester in a past life where you're literally looking at the screen going click, 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 click. And imagine doing that day in, day out. Well, we want to take away the drudgery of manual testing and get testers back to what they're good at, which is actually finding bugs and going off the beaten path sometimes to surface information for the development team. And one way to do that is to capture the information and all of the actions that they're performing as they move through that particular test case and allow them to replay that later on to fast forward through subsequent test case iterations. To do that, I'll just say create action recording, and I'll start this test. Now, if you're not creating an action recording, you can just start testing your application and filing bugs straight away. If you are creating an action recording, however, I suggest being a little bit more disciplined about the individual test steps that you run and marking them each as passed or failed. The reason for that is that then on subsequent runs, if you decide you just want to run steps 1 through 5, then we know what the affiliation is between steps 1 through 5 and the actions that make up steps 1 through 5. That's also important if you do something like create a coded UI test, because later on, as you'll see, when I create that coded UI test, it actually takes those actions and creates software methods within that coded UI test which correspond to each one of those steps. But the only way we can get that correlation is if you actually mark it as pass-fail. So at this point, I'll just start testing my application and following through my test case. I'll say that that passed. That passed. And here's where I want to take advantage of those parameter values. So you can see over on the left-hand side, it says first name should be Michael, last name is Affronti. So if I just start pasting, I can paste. Oops. I've seen this happen before with KVM devices. It likes to hijack my machine here. Bear with me here. I'm sorry? Oh, okay. There we go. Cool. Maybe that worked there. There we go. All right, we're back on track. Sorry about that. Thanks for the tip there. I don't know what I did in that case. I'm not quite sure. Sometimes with these KVM devices, they like to hijack the control key so that you can actually bring up an on-screen display. So this isn't something that you should encounter in the wild, but when I'm plugged in up here, occasionally it gets in the way and intercepts the control. So I apologize for that, but I think we're back on track here. So what I'm doing here is that as I move through this particular test case, it's recognizing the actions that I'm performing and the fact that I'm copying these values and pasting them into these individual cells. And if you can see, I'm not going to zoom because that'll actually capture it in my action recording, but if you can see on each row here, I get that little data bind icon. So that's telling me that the first name is now bound to that particular text box, and the last name is bound to that particular text box. So that makes it really nice. Also, I could change this form later on. I could reorder it. I could move things around. I could change those labels, and this would just work. So it's pretty robust behind the scenes. We'll say that this passed, and we'll click on Review Order. Don't write down my credit card number. And then here it's asking me to confirm that the receipt number is here. And sure enough, I see a receipt number up there, so that looks good enough to me. We'll go ahead and pass that, and then we'll close the browser. So now the first way through that test case iteration, it captured all of my action recordings. I'm not sure how it's going to behave when we play this back given the little control key failure, but let's go ahead and try this again. And what I can do is actually just select steps 1 through 9 and then play that back, and then that'll hand it back to the manual tester so that they can do their job. Maybe it's performed some action that can't be automated, or maybe it's actually using their eyeballs to look at the screen and say, yes, this looks good. And so what I'll do is just say play. It's going to play it back. And we think we have gotten to the point that it's about 10 to 15 times faster than the fastest manual tester. Hey, it's kind of figuring it out. All right, that worked. And so what we'll do now is we'll just say that that passed, and then just for fun, I will automate closing the browser. So let's say that we found a bug. Let's go on to the next iteration. Let's take a look at that receipt screen a little bit more closely. Just play back to get to that point. Now, one of the knee-jerk reactions I see a lot of organizations do is the development team says to the test team, hey, you know, we're tired of having to do this back and forth of trying to figure out how to reproduce this bug. So the next time you find a bug, if you could just please fill out this 6-page Word document that includes the system information, the build number, exactly what you clicked on, screenshots, yada, 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 and don't forget the cover sheet, that would be great. And so now as a tester, I'm looking at this saying, well, I just found a bug, but I really want to go to lunch soon, so I don't really want to fill out all that information manually. I'll just say that customers probably won't find that bug. That's obviously not the type of behavior we want to encourage. And so here, when I capture a bug, we make it really easy for you to give that information richly back to the development team. So if I look over to the right here, now that I'm scrolling to the right, I notice that this receipt number is actually not formatted properly. And so what I can do is capture a screenshot here and go ahead and create a bug and say something like, receipt is not formatted correctly. I'll assign that to Abu. And now when I close this and go back to Visual Studio, you'll see what Abu gets when he actually opens up this bug. So there's my receipt bug. Now in the past, I would have been really lucky to get a bug that looks like that, call it a day. But here you can see that if I scroll down, we actually get some interesting information. I'm automatically getting the system information because Microsoft Test Manager knows which build I'm running with. So there I can see that this tester is running with the correct build. We can see the machine name that they were running on. So they were running with Windows Server, Service Pack 2, how much RAM they had, what type of processor, what type of Service Pack level. If I jump over to details, you can see exactly which test case they were running as well as the individual test steps that they ran. I can take a look at things like video recording. So if I jump straight to this video recording, that would open up and show me exactly what the tester was doing. So all this information now is at my fingertips. I don't have to pick up the phone. I don't have to call the tester and say, what were you doing exactly? I should have everything I need to figure out how to fix this problem and make sure that that doesn't happen again. Okay. So that's authoring a test case and running a test case. There are a lot of other interesting things within Microsoft Test Manager that you may not discover unless you actually take a look at the documentation, because some of them are a little bit interesting to discover. One of those is our pick-a-build functionality. So I mentioned that Microsoft Test Manager knows which build you're running with. And the way that it knows which build you're running with is that each day you probably have a tester that goes in and scouts the builds and says, yes, this one is installing and this one's not installing. And then once you find the builds that actually do install and may be worth your time, you then have to answer the question of, okay, well, we were running with a build yesterday and we ran a bunch of test cases over there, but what changed since yesterday? And if you're not using a tool like this, then that probably results in a tester running around and talking to all the developers and saying, hey, what change did you make? And the developer says, oh, I just changed this C# file. And the tester says, well, what does that mean exactly? Give me some love here. And so one of the things we wanted to surface is all the rich information within Team Foundation Server that we already have about the builds that you're using. And so if I now assign a new build, I can flip this back to say, okay, I'm using build .3 today, and there's a new .4 build available. What is actually different about this particular build? And down below, we're actually pulling in all of this rich information from Team Foundation Server to say these are the work items that changed within this particular build. And I can look at this and say, okay, somebody checked in something having to do with a regular expression. That doesn't mean much to me. That doesn't impact my test plan. So I'm going to skip this build, but I'll take a look at the next one. And here we can just build upon that list and say, well, there's my regular expression thing, which is still new, comparing last build or the current build to the next build. But I also see that this particular user story was resolved. And I actually know that I'm waiting for this user story to be ready so that I can start my testing. So now I know right away that this is an interesting build. So that's nice to know. And if I switch to the latest build, it gets even better because there's a bug fix in there as well. So I like this build. I'm going to go ahead and assign it to my plan, which tells all of my testers, this is the build you should be testing with. Now, the next thing that happens is, all right, we know that there's some bug fixes we need to go validate. We know that there's some new functionality we need to test. But what about things that were working yesterday that maybe are broken today? That introduces a new technology we have in 2010 called test impact analysis. The idea with test impact analysis is as you're running your tests, whether those are manual tests or automated tests, we actually can build a database behind the scenes that says when you ran this test, it actually touched these 3 DLLs, and within this particular DLL, it hit these 5 methods. So then from that information, if Howie makes a change and checks in some code which changes a method down here, we can trace that back and say, you know what, this list of tests actually is impacted by that. So you should consider rerunning those tests. Now, it doesn't mean those tests are going to fail, because I know Howie's a great developer. I'm going to just check him anyway. But it also means that I can spend my time focused on that subset of tests as opposed to the entire set of tests that I ran yesterday. So maybe if I have half an hour before I go on my lunch break, this is the set of tests that I might choose to run. And so if I can say view recommended tests, that comes back and says, these are the 2 tests which the last time you ran them, they passed, and now, based on some code changes, these might be some tests you want to consider rerunning again. You'll notice actually here that these are the same test case. It's actually spread against 2 different test configurations. The reason for that is that one of them is meant to be tested on Windows Server, and one's meant to be tested on Windows 7. So now what I can do is just pop both of these back to an active state, and now if I flip back over to my test tab, you'll notice that when I look at the list of tests that I have to run, then these are both active again. So we think this is a great time saver. This isn't the only thing that you should rely on when determining which tests you need to rerun. There could be other environmental changes or database changes that could mean that you need to rerun certain tests. But again, just in terms of like sticking a finger in the air and saying, okay, what's the wind telling me today? Where should I spend my time before my lunch break? Test impact analysis is a really nice way to help you with that. Okay? That's a great question. Let me repeat that. So he's asking, did it recommend those tests based on the fact that the user story was changed and the bug was fixed, or was it purely based on source code? And the answer is the latter. It was purely based on source code. So another exercise that may be left to the tester is to then take a look at that set of user stories that was checked in or bugs that were fixed and decide from there may be a new set of tests that were blocked yesterday that I can now run. Or I found a bug yesterday, the developer is telling me that they fixed it, I need to now rerun that test to make sure that it's actually checked in and correct. Where was the association made between source codes and test cases? That's also a great question. So when I'm running my individual test cases within, actually there's two parts of that answer. One is for manual tests and one's for automated tests. When I'm running my tests within Microsoft Test Manager, one of the test settings that I have is test impact analysis. So if I flip back to my plan and take a look at properties and open this up, if I look at the options that I have here, test impact is one of those that you can turn on. And I have it disabled for this particular plan, but you'd usually want to run that most of the time. So as you run an individual test case, from the moment you click start this test case, we'll take a look at all the managed code that you're running, and we'll say, okay, these 10, 15, 20 methods are the ones that this test case ends up impact or using as part of the test run, so that later on, if you change that, then we can say this particular test case should be rerun. Now, on automated tests, it's a similar story. You get these same sets of options now in 2010 where you can actually configure what's called a test settings file, and then you make that part of your build, like your nightly build. And then, again, as we run that individual unit test or web performance test or coded UI test, we're doing the exact same thing. We're saying, while this test is being run, which code is actually being executed, and let's remember that so that if a change happens, we can make that recommendation. Great questions. Yeah. Test impact analysis does not look at the change sets. It doesn't need that information. That's correct. The change sets, that's all information for your testers to look at and say, okay, this requirement is supposedly working. Let's double check and make sure that the developer has implemented this correctly. Yep. Is it able to do this across all the tiers? And the answer is yes for your managed code. So test impact analysis does require that you're running code that's based on .NET Framework 2 or above. But if you have, let's say, ASP.NET code that's running on your web tier, and then on your database tier, maybe you're calling into some managed libraries that you've written. If any of those changes happen in the future and those get updated, then we'll remember that and we'll be able to flag that. Yeah. A little bit of black magic, right? Okay. So where am I here? So that's Microsoft Test Manager. Usually the next question I get here is, all right, you showed me a bunch of test automation steps in here where I can record and then play back exactly what you did. What application frameworks does that work with? And I know this is an iChart slide, so if you're in the back, I'm sorry, but this is part of my deck. It's also part of the documentation that you can access as well. But basically, just to recap here, if you're working with web applications, even if those involve JavaScript, AJAX calls, we'll capture and play those back very, very well. If you're working with Windows Forms, WPF applications, those are also supported. SharePoint is supported. That works very well. Firefox is now supported in Feature Pack 2, so you can download Feature Pack 2 from your MSDN subscription if you have that, along with your Test Professional or Visual Studio Ultimate SKU. And then we also support Silverlight 4 in-browser applications, also with Feature Pack 2. Now, when you get further down this list, your results may vary. So Win32 applications, my advice is to always just try it. You know, there's some things that work, some things that don't work. It just depends on the level of accessibility support that we have for those particular controls that you're using within your applications. Custom controls for web applications work quite well, but custom controls from third parties that you may be using for Windows Forms or WPF applications, those are going to require a custom set of extensibility packs. So I would encourage that if you're using those from a third-party vendor, talk to them about your desire to see this supported within this tool set, and they can see what they can do about plugging into our model. VB6, yes, that would more or less fall under Win32. I've seen it work. I've also seen edge cases where it doesn't work. So rather than try to pore over the specifics of what works and what doesn't, my advice is always, if you don't have this tool, download the trial, fire it up, record a test, and see how it goes. Yeah. So the other aspect of application lifecycle management is that because we're bringing all this data together into one central hub, and that hub for us is Team Foundation Server, we should really be able to paint a story which is greater than the sum of the parts and give you information that you can use to steer your projects in real time. And so that's what we've done with Team Foundation Server. You might recognize this gentleman. This is Lord Kelvin, and he's commonly credited with saying you cannot manage what you cannot measure. And so I'll just show you a few of the reports that you get out of the box with Team Foundation Server. There are a lot of custom reports you can create. You can write against our data warehouse and generate some really interesting reports to tell you what the relationship is between the code changes you're making and how your test plans are progressing. This is one that I like to call the Steven Sinofsky report. The reason for that is that Windows 7 was actually built using an early version of Team Foundation Server 2010. They came to us with some requirements years ago and said, we want to use Team Foundation Server to actually project manage the entire next release of Windows, but in order to do so, we need you to support hierarchical work items. And if you're familiar with TFS, you know that was a new feature we added in 2010, and we first delivered it to the Windows team so that they could build Windows 7, and incidentally, Office 2010 was built with this as well. And what's really nice about this report is that moving left to right, I can be a CTO or somebody high up in the food chain and understand, okay, I have a feature that's really important to me. So, for example, the second one on the list, as a customer, I want to track my order history. And moving left to right, I can start to answer questions like, how much of the work has been done to implement this feature? And I look at that and say, okay, 79% of the work has been done according to the developers. They've checked in tasks. They've reported their information as they've gone along. But then I may feel good about that until I get to the next perspective on here, which says that no tests have been written, no tests have been run against this particular feature. So my confidence then is that this feature may not quite be 80% done, right? And so across the board, we know that a single metric can be very misleading. If you look at any one metric in and of itself, like the number of bugs a tester finds, a tester could find 400 bugs, but none of those are actually really interesting. And another tester may find 5 bugs that your customers are actually likely to hit. So which one's actually more important? So we want to give you those multi-dimensional perspectives so you can start to at least have these discussions amongst your team about this different set of data. Here's another one that shows you the SharePoint dashboard you can get when you set up Team Foundation Server, and it drops all these reports in for you automatically. If you're not using SharePoint, you can still get these reports. You just don't have the nice dashboard experience. And what you can see here is the bugs as they're moving through the system. So each build, how is our test plan progressing against each one of these sets of bugs? Are we actually eliminating bugs, or are we growing the number of bugs in our system? The next one shows you how much of that code is changing on a daily basis. So code churn gives you an interesting measure of quality. And so at Microsoft, we have something I'm sure similar to what you do, where as you get closer and closer to releasing software, you want to make sure that the amount of code you're changing is actually going down, and so you're stabilizing. So a few months before any milestone release, any developer can just go in and start checking in code, and we don't really have these constant monitoring of what's going on in the system. But once we get within some time frame, maybe it's 2 months out from a release, then we'll shift into what's called tell mode. In tell mode, everybody comes into a ship room meeting each morning, and they say, I'm making this change. So if you're the CLR and you're making a change and somebody else relies on something that is changing within the CLR, then they should take that under guidance and actually make sure that they're testing the dependent change there. After a while, we then move into what's called ask mode, where in order to make a change, you show up to ShipRoom and you say, this is the change we want to make, this is why we want to make it, here's the customer data, or maybe this is a security fix that we just have to make. And then sometimes you even throw up the code on the screen and you have lots of vice presidents saying, now wait a minute, why are you using a integer there? Shouldn't you be using a long? So that's a really interesting discussion. But from these reports, you can start to make sure that you're actually trending towards normal and trending towards stabilization. And so what you can see on this report on the right is that a lot of people are actually checking in code maybe the last weekend before we ship out to the customer. We need to go back and make sure that we're really testing and understanding those changes. And again, all this data comes straight out of Team Foundation Server. This other one tells a couple of different stories. So this highlights kind of the value of having those multiple perspectives. The report on the upper left shows my task burn down. So as developers are coming in and checking in code, they're saying, okay, I just accrued 5 hours against the plan, or I just finished this particular task. And it looks pretty good. We're trending normally. We're on track to hit our date there. The problem with that is when you look at the other perspective down below, this user story progress, and you can see we're not actually closing out those user stories. So we're never getting to a point then that our test team has a fully functional piece of code that they can actually test and feel good about to say, yes, user sign-in is working, or yes, credit card validation is working. And so this could be a sign to the team that rather than do a little bit of work over here and a little bit of work over there, we actually need to consolidate our efforts, make sure we close out a few user stories so that the test team has what they need to start testing. So just lots of interesting ways of looking at the data. And again, you get all this for free. This is our team system web access information that we've converted into web parts. So you can create custom dashboards that show a list of all of the bugs, scope by area or scope by iteration. So a lot of people have asked for that to create custom portals. This shows all my test plan progress. Now, I want to show you something that I've never shown in this session before, and that is a look at Visual Studio vNext testing. So if you came to the keynote yesterday, you saw a little bit of Visual Studio vNext, and I want to show you some of the investments we're making specifically around manual testing. Now, I have a talk that I normally give that's about an hour talking about the difference between formal test case management and agile test case management. And with formal test case management, you look at your requirements, you look at the things that you're changing, and you write test cases that make sure that, yes, you can do this feature, and if a user goes off the beaten path, they are not going to hit this bug, and that's formal test case management. We write down everything that we're testing. But occasionally, we can also find a lot of interesting bugs using exploratory testing as well, sometimes called XT testing, sometimes called agile testing. The idea is that we let our testers do what they do best, which is break things, right? And they may go off the beaten path, and they may say, okay, this week, what I'm going to focus on is making sure that on every single page of my e-commerce application, I can contact customer support, right? So that may be one thing that you want to go off the beaten path. It would not be, a good use of your time to write a test case for saying, okay, click on this page. Okay, click on this page. Do you see a customer support? Do you see customer support? But if you just give your testers kind of a guided exploratory test, then they can go out and make sure that that shows up on every single page. And so there's different charters and themes that I talk about in my other talk. If you are interested in that, there's a lot of great books. One from his name's escaping me, on exploratory testing. I'll think of it later. But let me show you Microsoft Test Manager vNext and show you how we're addressing exploratory testing. What you'll be able to do in the next version is actually just click over to the Test tab, and you'll just be able to click Explore. Now, I don't have to say that I am testing a particular test case. If I want, I can choose to associate the stuff that I'm doing with a particular requirement that exists in the system. I don't have to. I can just click on Explore, and this is going to open up the new Microsoft Test Runner and allow me to just start testing the application. And as I start testing the application, it's still doing those things that the last version did in terms of capturing a video recording. We can now capture audio annotation. So as I move through this tool, I might just want to say, hey, Howie, you should take a look at this. I can't contact customer support. Really frees my hands to focus on testing the application. So if I start testing this application and we open up our Fabricam Fiber customer portal, then again, all of my actions, everything that I do from this point forward are being captured. And I can take a look at this and I can say, you know what, this looks pretty good. I can come in here and bold that, make sure the team feels good about the work that they just did. And as I'm going through here, I can take a look and say, I want to capture a screenshot here. You saw Jason do this in the keynote. This is Latin. Is this getting fixed? And I can keep going, and I can move through the application. I can click on a few things. And as I'm doing this, all of my actions are being captured in the background so that when I find a bug like this, I can say, I think this is actually an interesting bug that we should maybe, not only fix, but create a test case from. So I can start by creating a bug here. And I can say, clicking on lots of customer records causes a crash. And here you can see that I have some other information that I've logged down here. So you can see the Latin information. Well, that's not really relevant to this particular bug. So what I can do is actually change these steps and scope that out of this particular result. And so now when I file this as a bug, it's going to only include the fact that I was clicking on multiple customer records in order to generate that. So I can create that as a bug. But the other thing that I can do is I can also create that as a test case as well, because this may be something that I now want to take out of the exploratory realm and move into a formal test case so that I make sure that my testers are capturing that in a systematic manner, and we're testing this with each and every build that comes out. So what I can do is I can say save and create test, and so this not only creates a bug now, but it also takes and files that test case for me. So now this is a test case. Make sure clicking lots of customer records doesn't crash the site. That would be a good thing. And then down here, you can see that it automatically captured those individual test steps. If I wanted to, maybe I could come in here and attach a screenshot or attach some additional information, maybe rename these steps. But it makes it really easy for me to just save that information. And then I can keep going. So now I'm back to my Microsoft Test Runner exploratory session, and I can keep moving around here and say, all right, this looks pretty good. Maybe something like, do we have the rights to this photo? That'd be a good thing to check into. And now when I create a bug, it's already scoped that to just the last few things that I did. Maybe it would be interesting for me to actually include the rest of this in here as well. I don't know. For this one, not sure it matters. But again, we wanted to really just give you that fine-grained control so that you can slide back and forth. We also want to make sure that this information works for the video recordings and the audio annotations that you're using as well, so that you're not just attaching the entire video recording. We're actually scoping that down to your specific exploratory session. Okay? So there you've seen it. That's the first look at the next version of Microsoft Test Manager. So as I mentioned, I think we're finishing a few minutes early here, so I will take questions. But as I mentioned, I have a test automation talk that's happening tomorrow morning. So if you're interested in seeing how this works in terms of taking a test and fully automating that as well, in fact, I do have a few minutes. I'm going to show you our first coded UI test. Be sure to come back for that. Let me just quickly do that here. Okay. So eventually you'll reach a point where your testers get tired of running the same manual test every single time. That particular UI has stabilized. It makes sense to potentially consider turning this into a fully automated test. So a coded UI test is basically created by creating a new test project. I can create these in Visual Studio with either Visual Basic or C#. And by default, when I open these up, I get my existing unit test. That's just the project template. I don't need that, so I can just add a new coded UI test. And when you add a coded UI test, you have a couple of different options for how you want to create this coded UI test. The first is you can either just start recording it from scratch, and we'll capture all of your actions as a developer as you move through the application and add assertions here and there. Or the other way you can do this is you can take advantage of the fact that the manual testers maybe already did this with their existing test cases and the associated automation, and I can pull in that existing associated automation. So let's do that. We'll use an existing action recording. I can pull that in. I think it's test case number 41 that I automated earlier. Sure enough, there it is. So we'll pull that in here. And what it's doing is it's now taking those individual test steps and the actions that were recorded against each one of those test steps, and it's now creating this in code format for me. So we'll take a deeper look at this tomorrow, but just quickly you can see here that I have this particular test method. If I go to definition for that, you'll see that this is what it's doing. So it's opening up that particular web application, and it's going to this web address. So each one of these test steps does something similar. And now if I run this test case, it should click through my application quickly for me. Now, the way that this might fail is if my application has changed and some of the buttons don't work. I can't flow from one screen to another. So that would actually surface a failure in this case. The other thing that we'll do tomorrow is we'll add some smart assertions in here as well, so that we're not just making sure that we can click through the application, but we're also inspecting controls on the page to say, does this have the right value? And so that's some additional logic that we'll add in tomorrow morning. So once you create these coded UI tests, it makes it really easy then to add those maybe to your nightly builds or your daily builds, and those can run automatically. They can also run within the context of a lab-managed environment as well. So if you want to test this on a machine running Windows Server, a different machine running Windows 7, you can point that at multiple virtual environments. We can spin up that virtual environment from ground zero to say we haven't installed any of our software yet. We can then take the software, check out that code from Team Foundation Server, maybe build an MSI or build some database deployment script, push that to one or more environments. And once your environments are set up, we can then start running those automated tests against those environments. So I'll show you that tomorrow morning as well. And there I have my test result. You can see that it passed each time. So please remember to fill out the session evals. We put a lot of work into these sessions. Want to make sure that we get your feedback and take those moving forward. And we have a few minutes here, so I'll stick around and answer any questions. Yeah. Thank you. The question is it possible to delete a test case through Test Manager? Not directly, no. So test cases are work items within Team Foundation Server, and without giving you a full history into the design considerations for how we created work items, we don't make it easy for the user to create work items. Customers have told us that they want us to generally keep those work items so that they can always refer back to the history, and if someone accidentally deleted something from the system, then they may lose a lot of information. Instead, what you can easily do is you can actually just remove it from your test plan. And removing it from your test plan is as simple as opening up, if I show you here, I can open up my test plan, and then, as you might expect, if I come into Contents, and I find a test case I want to get rid of, I can just click on that and then delete it, and it goes away. It's still within Team Foundation Server, but it's no longer in my test plan. My testers are no longer going to see that. So that's removed the association from that plan. Yes, you can use a power tool called destroy that actually destroys a work item completely. That's a command line prompt, so it's something that you can't strictly do within Microsoft Test Manager, but if you're comfortable dropping to the command line, you can do that. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, sure. So his question is, you know, why would you ever, I think it's why would you ever want to change what you're collecting? Capture an action recording. Yeah, that's a really astute question. Yeah, there's a subtle difference there. So when you capture an actions within the test settings, it's capturing that to save to the test results. So if I open up those test results, I can open up, it'll just be a plain text file that says, you know, tester clicked here, click there, type this, click there. The action recording is actually based on the same information, but it's whether or not you want to record that so that you can play it back in the future. And each test case can only have one action recording, which is why you may want to open up a test case and just quickly test something without re-recording and taking the time to make sure you're very meticulous about the things that you click on. So that's why we give you that option there. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yep. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yep. Okay, great. Let me address both of those questions. So his first question was you have headless machines that run in different parts of the world. How can you take advantage of some of these tools so that you can capture information from those test runs? And our architecture uses what are called test agents that you can deploy onto any Windows operating system. And from that, they can then talk back to what are called test controllers. If you take a look at Howie's documentation, he's got some excellent steps on how to set those up. And you basically say, all right, this particular test agent needs to run all of my 64-bit machines, 64-bit tests, right? So the test controller looks around and says, do I have an available test agent that can run these 64-bit tests? It needs to have, you know, Internet Explorer. You can use different tags there, and then it will find the machine that's ready to run those tests. And when it runs those tests and gets the results, it can then post them back to Team Foundation Server by way of that controller. So yes, you can do that. Your other question actually hits on something we showed in the keynote, which is you wanted to have a way for maybe end users or people that don't have Microsoft Test Manager to at least run through the application and capture some of this rich information. That's absolutely part of our vision. So we have a new feedback client that's coming in vNext that just, I mean, we haven't worked out the exact implementation for that yet, but imagine you'll be able to send an email to the person in London who's paying for your project, and you can say, hey, install this client. It'll be a quick install, not a 4 gig Visual Studio install, but just a quick install that gives them a feedback pane similar to what I showed for the exploratory testing. As they're going through and testing the application, they can say, hey, this looks great, or hey, you need to fix this logo. That's our old company logo, that sort of thing, right? So yes, absolutely want to enable that scenario so you can get that rich information, not just from testers that have this tool, but from end users that are just playing with your software. Yeah, great questions. Who's next? Sorry. Yeah. My blog URL, I'll put it back on the screen. Yeah. Unfortunately, no, you can't author tests in Test Manager without having Team Foundation Server. So we do require Team Foundation Server. The other thing I will say, though, is that in the 2010 release, we did a lot of work to make sure that it's very easy for you to set up TFS. If you've gone to Brian Randall's workshop, he showed setting up Team Foundation Server. You can get it running in about 20 minutes. You can even run it on a client operating system now. And we give it to you if you have an MSDN subscription, so you don't have to pay anything separate for it. So hopefully that helps if you're not using Team Foundation Server. Occasionally the follow-up question is people say, I have another bug tracking system or version control system. I want to synchronize the data. If you stop by our booths over in the expo hall, we can have that conversation. We have some different migration and integration options for taking some third-party system and pushing that data back and forth between Team Foundation Server. So it's a little bit long-winded to have it right now, but we'll take that offline. Yeah. Yeah. The best way to report issues and problems if you're having issues with these tools. So there's a couple of ways. The free way, of course, is to come to the MSDN forums, and there's a forum specifically for Test Professional. I can't remember if it's called Test Professional or Microsoft Test Manager, but if you drop into that, the product team monitors that. We have a lot of MVPs on those alias and customer support professionals that monitor that. And then, of course, you can always call support and open up an incident. Chances are, based on the way that you buy software from us, you may already have some free incidents that you can use, and you can apply those to actually help us investigate issues. I'll also say take a look at Service Pack 1. Service Pack 1 fixes a lot of little fit and finish issues with the tool set. So if you're not using Service Pack 1, make sure you apply that. And that's just Visual Studio Service Pack 1. We'll update that. I think we had a question over here. Yeah.
Yep. I have 3 questions. One was already asked about for which you answered as a feedback client. Mm-hmm. So just wanted to confirm, you said that would be in the vNext?
That's right.
Okay. And the second one is, again, it's regarding the vNext. You showed that we can, when we click the create bug, we can also save it as a test. So every time we have to save it as a test, we have to go through the create bug path, or is it there is a separate way? Because I think that's a misleading term too. If we always want to.
No, you have multiple options there, and I understand your concern. Yeah, you can create a test case the way that I created a test case earlier. Just open up a new form and start typing in the individual steps. You can also, when I created a test case, I didn't have to create a test case. I could have created a bug, but in this particular case, I chose to create a test case and a bug because I wanted to formalize that exploratory test so that it was captured as part of my plan moving forward. That's a great question. Okay, and the third one was, and I think that is again already there, that we can have different platforms for a test case. Mm-hmm. So my concern is that as a drop-down menu that you have 3 different platforms hitting in there. Mm-hmm. So a person might not know if he's not clicked that. So is there a way that somebody can be stopped from going to another test before he completes through all the platforms? You can't require that they go through one test before going to another test, but you can order the way in which tests appear in these test suites, and then give that guidance to the team to say you need to go through this test, then this test, then this test. We don't enforce that they have to follow that. That's something you should share with your team. But you'll notice here that in this case, as a tester, most of the time I actually live just in the test tab, and this gives me the list of test cases that I should run. I'm not actually manipulating the configurations.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was looking for. It's the same test case, but different configuration.
Exactly.
Yeah, this is what I was looking for. All right.
Absolutely, okay. Yeah. And let me show you actually really quick. You can actually override this as well. So for this particular test case, maybe I know that it also needs to be tested in these different configurations.
All right.
So.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you import the test into the build and it becomes an automated unit test build, like in our case, when our build runs at night, it doesn't run on an application server. So would it be able to execute the unit test on an actual application server that has all the bells and whistles that the program is looking to actually
Yes,
kick off and fire.
Absolutely. So that gets back to the test agent architecture that I was describing, where you can say, I'm going to install a test agent on these 5 machines, and one's running SQL Server 08, one's running SQL Server 08 R2, and then maybe one of those is 32-bit.
Is that
right?
pretty intuitive in the system and easy to set up, or?
I think it has. I've done it a few times, so I'm a bad person to ask. But yes, if you look at the documentation, it'll actually take you through exactly how to set up what's called a test controller. That test controller gets wired to Team Foundation Server. You install the test agents on each one of the machines where you're running those tests, and then you define within each one of those agent profiles what those tags are, so that when the test controller is looking around to say, do I need to run this test on an R2 box or just a gold image box, we can find the right place to run those tests and report the results.
Okay.
Yeah, great. I'll come back to you. Yep.
So earlier on, it seemed like you were kind of wearing 2 hats, mostly tester, but then you switched over into a Visual Studio role as that bug was filed.
Yeah.
But how does the developer know about that bug? I didn't see like you send an email and say, I discovered this bug. Is it just some more of that black magic stuff? It just magically appears?
Well, so that gets back to, if you're using Team Foundation Server on a daily basis and I'm a developer, I'm probably coming into this list of bugs on a regular basis to see what's filed against me. Team Foundation Server also supports alerts as well. So I could subscribe to alerts for a given query and say anytime there's a new bug that shows up with my name on it, I want an email. So I didn't show you the email in my demo flow, but yes, you could have set that up so that it emails the tester or the developer. In the next release, you may have seen in the keynote, we want to help contextualize this even further. So we have a new My Work tab. So as a developer, I just open up My Work during the course of the day, and that shows me all of the tasks that are assigned to me, all of the bugs that are assigned, code reviews I need to work on. So really just give me that contextualized experience so that I know what my next job is.
Okay, great. Thank you. And one other question. Is there any way to kind of do some of the exploratory testing in the versions that we have now?
Yes, you can, and I didn't show that. I thank you for bringing that up. Yes, you can. What you don't get there is you don't get the slider so that you can actually go back and forth and specify. You get a slider, but it doesn't tell you which individual test steps are included as part of that. It's kind of a blind slider that goes back to say, all right, this is 30 minutes or 30 seconds worth of testing. So yes, you can still do that. The other difference is that you actually need a test case to create as kind of a dummy test case, and then you start your testing from there, as opposed to in the next version, you can just click Explore and you're off and running. But those are kind of fit and finish things. You can absolutely do exploratory testing today. Yes, you were next.
We have a model where we have existing test cases, and
Mm-hmm.
we then build out new features. We don't always necessarily go back and run the entire test. We sort of do the quick positive test.
Yep.
So we try to build out test cases that do the positive testing, that new feature, and then we go back and integrate them back into our questions.
Okay.
The test case manager allows us to facilitate that, taking that delta and merging it back to the test case that we typically build.
Yeah, I think what you're asking is the ability to easily query from previous test plans, bring those test cases forward into the next iteration's test plan, and then continue to build on that over time. Oh, you want to copy an existing test case and then evolve that over time. Yeah, so people usually ask for that in 2 different ways. One is to actually kind of version the test case and baseline that and take that moving forward. We don't support baselining of test cases, but what you can easily do is you can right-click and say copy a test case, and you can assign that to a different iteration because it's a work item. So I could drop down and say this is the test case that makes sure I can sign in this version of the release, and then copy that for the next iteration where maybe we're saying you can now log in with your Facebook account. So let me add the necessary steps to augment that test case. So yes, you can get that. It's not quite baselining, which some people are after, but yes, you can do those copying of test cases. Yeah. I think you were next. Try tapping it a few times.
No?
No?
I can just walk away.
Oh, no, we got you there. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. We have Visual Studio and TFS, they're integrated for the developers, but it's not yet integrated for the testers.
Okay.
We have a whole load of Excel spreadsheets which hold the test cases.
Yep.
Would it be better to load them in Microsoft Test Manager? Do you use that term interchangeably between TFS and the Microsoft Test Manager, or they're two separate products?
So yes, that's kind of confusing, and you can blame the marketing team for this one. But yes, everything that I showed today is part of the overall Visual Studio brand. Within that brand, Visual Studio used to be strictly for developers. We're now expanding that to include other roles, other stakeholders as well. Testers are one of those. As a tester, you would get what's called Visual Studio Test Professional, which gives you the Microsoft Test Manager client. There is a tool on Codeplex.com called TCM Import, Test Case Management Import, that you can point at your existing Excel database or your Word documents, and you can pull forward. That will help you pull forward your existing test cases into this tool, which then, when you use Microsoft Test Manager, everything gets stored in Team Foundation's server.
Would it impact the licensing costs for anything? So now testers need Visual Studio.
Testers need Microsoft Test Manager, which comes with Visual Studio Test Professional, which is priced differently than Visual Studio that you might buy for your developers. And we'd be happy to, I think we're running out of time, so maybe we can follow up with that one. And then maybe just, we'll make sure we talk after this, and then one more question if it's quick.
In our case, we have bugs and builds in one project and user stories in another project.
Yep. Okay.
Do you see any restrictions on Test Manager? Because I saw that bugs were created directly on the same project as the test plan.
Sure. You could track your test. Is it a different team project?
It's in the same catalog, but a different team project.
Okay. Yes, you should be able to file that against whichever project you want. I'd have to double check that. I can't remember if that UI drop down is there. But let's maybe go ahead and wrap up here so the next speaker can get ready, and then we'll hang out if you have questions. Great. Yeah. Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. My email is bryankell@microsoft.com. So thank you very much for coming. Enjoy TechEd.